Can you describe more about how standard or mainstream media has helped to facilitate, enable these kind of attacks? And, in particular, this example of Claudine Gay probably, it's not the only example, but it's the one that most people seem to know about.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be part of this rich conversation, and so many things are sort of echoing here. And one of the points that was just talked about is to think about how to connect what's going on to counter narratives. And some of those counter narratives are pretty important. And so that to understand Rufo, and I'll talk a little bit about his role, it's good to go back and think about where he came from, which he was a guy who basically went on Fox News, complained about wokeness and CRT, and President Trump was watching, and that's how there was this executive order that banned critical race theory training in the US government. And so there's a connection here to a broader political movement, and that's partly what motivates the research that I'm engaged in. And so I think a lot about political institutions, especially government institutions. As I'll talk more in the next slide, the key claim I have in looking at the current moment is that the US is in this unusual period. There's certainly echoes from different points in the past, but what we're witnessing right now is this really different experience to maybe what most people expect and have seen from the past, where there's this direct attack on institutions by these right-wing political movements. And if you study outside of the US, some of these patterns are actually quite familiar. Some of the tactics are tactics that we see in authoritarian regimes. And so the next slide, I sort of break down a couple of those. One is delegitimization. So attacking those regimes or attacking those institutions like government institutions, libraries, educational institutions, ones that people normally trust, with these sort of rhetorical strategies alleging that they're corrupt, trying to undermine that trust, deconstructing those institutions, trying to reduce capacity, trying to make them less effective, attacking individual actors within those institutions. And then the third tactic is control. So asserting some sort of direct political control that's answerable to the authoritarian regime. And so I think, as I mentioned in the next slide, you see aspects of that in the Claudine Gay case. We see another tweet here from Rufo, where he's very explicit in telegraphing his tactics. As you say, they're in plain sight. He's saying, we're launching this story, plagiarism story from the right, and we're going to get the media involved and do the work for us. And to be very clear, the objection to Gay here on the part of Rufo and the people that supported him was not really about Gay's views about the Middle East or campus protests, or really her record of scholarship, or about plagiarism. Those were all opportunities for them to go after Gay for what they perceived as her bigger sin, which is her support as dean for DEI and then as Harvard president. And they also saw her as a DEI pick for this very prestigious role and objected to her being in that position. And Rufo was very successful with that tactic. With Gay, the New York Times in particular incessantly flogged that story for over a month until Gay resigned. And I think if the most powerful news media organization in the world asks every day, is your tenure under threat, should you resign? Sooner or later, the people that work for you or the donors in your outside your organization or your board starts asking the same question, and it becomes really difficult to maintain your position with those types of accusations. And one of the things I mentioned about in writing about this case is that we can see parallel accusations of academic misconduct from, for example, the president of Stanford that got no attention until in the New York Times until he resigned. Or Judge Gorsuch, who was also accused of plagiarism, got almost zero attention during his nomination. And so there was a track record of responding to these accusations of plagiarism in the mainstream media and treating them in context, asking if they were politically motivated. But that strategy just didn't seem to apply to Gay. Gay was held to a much different standard. And I think it is, and Rufo is pretty explicit about this, because of her association with DEI.
And, you know, one of the attacks, of course, on DEI related concepts might help explain why the New York Times was so focused on Gay and not any of the other cases. We don't get a chance under this new regime to talk about implicit biases or to talk about the makeup of, you know, the editorial pages and the newsroom. So this appears to simply be the product of good reporting as opposed to the frameworks that tell people what's important and what's not, that sometimes are implicitly shaped by race. You've published in your Substack the media complicity against attacks against racial justice and education and democracy more broadly. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the strategy that has been tried and tested, as Christopher Rufo said, and now how it's being deployed to target other university faculty, officials, programs, an entire orientation around inclusive education and institutions.
Yeah, I think the strategy that Rufo follows is pretty consistent over time, which is you build a negative brand and you contort the meaning of that brand, you make people fearful about it, and you repeat the brand relentlessly. And he did that with CRT. He sort of took that and tried to make this as negative and scary sounding a brand as possible. And he did it with plagiarism. And so he used plagiarism as sort of a wedge issue to go after these scholars. He did it again a couple of weeks ago, and I think successfully with Gay, because the media went along with it and treated this as sort of a national news story. He did it more recently with another scholar who I happen to know slightly. She wrote an article for a symposium that I wrote, that I edited for the Russell Sage Foundation. She's an excellent scholar. Christina Cross she's a sociologist at Harvard, and she is a Black scholar. She studies demography, family formation issues. Some of her works relates to race, but it seemed very much that she was being targeted because she is a Black scholar at Harvard, a female Black scholar, and this fit into the Claudine Gay narrative that Rufo was trying to build. And in this case, the attack just was less successful. The strategy was the same, which was there are these anonymous complaints. Someone has launched a complaint to some official at Harvard saying Christina Cross has engaged in plagiarism. She needs to be investigated. And you just report the complaint with very little context. You don't say who launched the complaint. You hope that the media will pick this up. On social media, you can amplify this. So Elon Musk is replying to Rufo's tweets about Christina Cross. And so it gets, the millions of impacts when people are seeing those tweets. But ultimately, it didn't really work quite as well in this case. The mainstream media did not pick it up. I sort of did a quick search on what media outlets covered the Cross story. There's a couple from Harvard Crimson and Rufo's own journal of choice, which is City Journal, which is published by the Manhattan Institute, a right-wing think tank organization. But it doesn't get broader pickup from that. And I think that's partly because there was, maybe not directly from Harvard, which could have done a lot better in this case, but among other scholars, a fairly rapid pushback where scholars said, this is a ridiculous set of claims. You're saying Christina Cross engaged in plagiarism when most of what she did was simply repeat data set names or standard methodological terms. and we don't consider that to be plagiarism. And I
Yeah.
think that sort of visible pushback really made a difference in this case.
And it's such a valuable lesson, too, as we reflect back on how quickly the fire that started with the attacks on critical race theory were able to take hold, partly because the response was more of a pivot rather than a direct confrontation in the way that we saw happening in this particular case. So hopefully, lesson learned. In our last minute, I'm wondering if you could help us think about some of the ways in which the right is now coming together with a blueprint for what their objectives are in the case of a victory, a Trump victory in 2025. It's actually called Project 2025. So can you just give our listeners some of the alarming things that you've uncovered that is in Project 2025?
Yeah, and I'll just talk through the next slide and leave it at that. But I think there are three big themes that you're seeing. One is reliance on conspiracist messaging that also has a strong racial element, which emphasizes us versus them messaging, and also restricts discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion or structural racism. And then you're seeing two other things happening. There's sort of an outside game where people like Rufo are going after individual actors. And so he's going after scholars, but in other cases, people are going after election officials or school board officials or people who are librarians. And so really scaring them, putting them under this unwelcome spotlight, presenting them as radical. And then the third strategy is playing an inside game where you're using political power to weaken institutional protections, rob people of, say, their job protections, limit what they can talk about. And what with Project 2025, what we're seeing here is the reliance on something called Schedule F, which I've written about a lot, but basically the ability to turn career civil servants into political appointees and then make them fireable at will. So President Trump could fire 50,000 political appointees once he has converted them from being career civil servants. And that's going to be a dramatic change in how American government works if that strategy comes to pass.
Wow. So this is effectively why we're doing this. We want people to fully understand, what is at stake.